Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Juliet Benjamin arrived at her bakery before dawn, as she always did, but that morning carried a strange weight she couldn't name. The street outside was still quiet, the kind of quiet that usually comforted her, yet today it felt watchful, almost expectant. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and inhaled deeply as the familiar sense of flour, yeast, and vanilla wrapped around her. Turning 35 should have felt celebratory, or at least reflective, but instead her chest felt tight. She tied her apron slowly, deliberately, as if grounding herself in routine could keep the unease at bay. Andrew hadn't called. No message. No rushed apology. Nothing. She told herself not to read into it, but the silence followed her like a shadow as she began measuring ingredients with practiced precision. As the dough mixed and rose, Juliet's thoughts drifted backward, uninvited. She remembered birthdays when Andrew had still tried, burnt candles, clumsy surprises, half-hearted jokes meant to charm her into laughter. Those memories felt distant now, like scenes from someone else's life. The ovens hummed softly, a steady, reassuring sound that contrasted sharply with the chaos she sensed hovering just beyond the bakery walls. A few early customers trickled in, greeting her warmly, unaware that today marked anything special. Juliet smiled, returned pleasantries, and focused on her work, but each glance at the clock reminded her of Andrew's absence. It wasn't just that he wasn't there, it was the certainty that he had chosen not to be. By mid-morning, sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating rows of fresh pastries arranged with care. Juliet paused for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and allowed herself a quiet breath. This bakery was hers, built with patience, sacrifice, and a love for baking that had sustained her 3 years of emotional compromise. Whatever the day would bring, this space still answered to her hands and her heart. Yet even as she straightened a tray and returned to the counter, that uneasy feeling refused to leave. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, something was moving toward her, something unseen but inevitable. Juliet didn't know it yet, but this birthday would divide her life into a before and an after, and the morning silence was only the beginning. The bell above the bakery door chimed just after noon, cutting cleanly through the low murmur of customers and the steady rhythm of Juliet's work. She looked up instinctively, expecting another familiar face from the neighborhood, but instead saw a young man standing hesitantly near the entrance. He wore a delivery uniform, neat but slightly wrinkled, and held a large, elaborately decorated cake box in both hands as if it carried more weight than sugar and sponge. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Juliet, and something in his expression, uncertain, apologetic, made her stomach tighten. Caleb Moore cleared his throat, stepping forward slowly, already sensing that this delivery was not an ordinary one. "Juliet Benjamin?" he asked, his voice careful, almost subdued. When she nodded, he shifted the box in his hands and explained that the cake was prepaid and requested to be delivered publicly, during business hours. That detail alone caused a few customers to glance over curiously. The cake was extravagant, layers tall enough to demand attention, wrapped in pristine white frosting with sharp, deliberate lettering across the top. As Caleb placed it on the counter, the room seemed to hold its breath. Juliet leaned closer, her heart pounding now, and read the words. The message was short, unmistakable, and cruel: "Congratulations, loser." A ripple of stunned silence swept through the bakery, followed by soft gasps and confused murmurs from patrons who suddenly understood they were witnessing something deeply wrong. Juliet felt the words land like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. Her face remained composed, though the color drained from it as she straightened slowly. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he backed away from the counter, regret etched across his features. He hadn't written a message, but in that moment, he felt complicit in the cruelty it carried. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering in disbelief, others staring openly at Juliet, unsure whether to offer comfort or retreat. The cake sat there like an accusation, loud and obscene in its elegance. Juliet said nothing. She simply met Caleb's eyes briefly, an exchange heavy with shared discomfort, before turning back to the counter. The humiliation had arrived, uninvited and undeniable, and the bakery would never feel the same again. Juliet did not raise her voice, did not cry, and did not allow the shock to fracture her posture in front of the watching room. She thanked the delivery man softly, her tone steady enough to confuse those who expected a reaction, and asked one of her assistants to escort him out. The cake remained on the counter, its message glaring beneath the bakery lights, yet Juliet treated it as if it were no more than an accounting error waiting to be corrected. Customers murmured among themselves, discomfort spreading like a stain. Some looked at Juliet with sympathy, others with curiosity, but none dared speak. She continued serving pastries, her movements precise, controlled, as though discipline alone could hold her together. When the last customer finally left and the door locked behind them, Juliet's restraint cracked, not outwardly, but inwardly, in a way far more devastating. She carried the cake into the storage room at the back, shutting the door behind her with care, as if noise itself would be too much to bear. The small space smelled of flour and cardboard, of work and survival, and suddenly it felt unbearably close. Her hands began to shake as she stared at the cake, at the words written so deliberately, so publicly. This was not a careless mistake or a tasteless joke. This was intention. This was Andrew choosing cruelty, choosing spectacle, choosing someone else's approval over her dignity. Juliet sank onto a crate, pressing her palms against her temples as the truth settled in with crushing clarity. The marriage she had tried to preserve through patience and silence had already ended, perhaps long before today, but this moment stripped away the final illusion. Tears finally came, hot and quiet, not dramatic enough to feel like release. She didn't sob, she simply breathed through the pain, letting it pass through her without resistance. In that storage room, surrounded by the tools of her own hard-earned independence, Juliet understood something vital. This was not just humiliation. It was a fracture so deep it could not be repaired. Whatever came next would require a choice she had been avoiding for years, and once she made it, there would be no turning back. Across town, in a restaurant designed to impress more than to nourish, Andrew Coleman leaned back in his chair and lifted his glass with performative ease. The place glowed with soft lighting and polished surfaces, the kind of setting where reflections mattered more than substance. Alicia Gordon sat beside him, impeccably dressed, her laughter light and well-timed, calibrated to draw attention without seeming desperate for it. The table was crowded with expensive plates and louder opinions, and Andrew basked in the feeling of being seen. He checked his phone once, quickly, then turned it face down, as if dismissing an afterthought. The absence of Juliet from his mind felt deliberate, almost triumphant. Alicia nudged him playfully, asking whether the cake had arrived yet, her eyes sharp beneath the flirtation. Andrew smirked, recounting the message he'd approved with a cruel casualness, framing it as a necessary lesson. Around them, Victor Lang and a few others laughed too loudly, clinking glasses in approval. Someone joked about timing and making a statement, and Andrew nodded along, feeding off the validation. The cruelty wasn't hidden. It was celebrated, reframed as wit and confidence. Alicia watched him closely, satisfaction flickering across her face, not just at Juliet's humiliation, but at how easily Andrew bent toward the worst version of himself when applauded. As the night stretched on, music swelled and more drinks arrived, blurring judgment and sharpening bravado. Andrew spoke about ambition, about not being held back by sentimentality, about choosing a life that looked successful from the outside. Alicia leaned in, whispering assurances that he deserved more, that he was finally being honest with himself. He believed her, or wanted to. Somewhere, beneath the laughter and clatter of silverware, a line was being crossed, one that would not announce itself with drama or regret. The party rolled on, glittering and hollow, while consequences gathered quietly, unnoticed, already beginning to take shape far beyond the restaurant's walls. Juliet returned to the bakery long after sunset, not to work, but to close a chapter of her life with intention. She cleaned slowly, methodically, as if order could steady her thoughts. The cake was gone, discarded without ceremony, its message no longer deserving space in her world. When she finally locked the door, she did not go home immediately. Instead, she sat in her car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring ahead while memories pressed in from all sides. Andrew's laughter, the public cruelty, the years of swallowed discomfort, they converged into a single, undeniable truth. Whatever she returned to that night could no longer be called a marriage. She packed quietly. No dramatic gestures, no notes left behind. Just clothes, important documents, and a few personal items gathered with care. The house felt unfamiliar as she moved through it, stripped of warmth by the realization that love had long ago been replaced by convenience and contempt. When she stepped outside with her bags, the night air felt colder than usual, sharper against her skin, but also clarifying. Juliet drove across town to her mother's home, her chest tightening as old fears surfaced. She had promised herself long ago that she wouldn't return like this, wounded, uncertain, but some promises, she was learning, needed to be broken to survive. Martha Benjamin opened the door before Juliet could knock a second time, as if she had sensed her arrival. She took one look at her daughter's face and said nothing, simply pulling her into a firm, grounding embrace. There were no questions, no lectures, no demands for explanation. Inside, the house was warm and familiar, filled with the quiet strength of someone who had endured and learned. Martha set a kettle on the stove, offered Juliet a seat, and waited. In that silence, unforced and compassionate, Juliet felt something shift. For the first time since the humiliation, she wasn't bracing herself. She was home, and whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Alicia Gordon woke late the next morning in a penthouse apartment that didn't belong to her, sunlight spilling across marble floors and designer furniture arranged for display rather than comfort. She stretched languidly, reaching for her phone before her feet touched the ground, scrolling through messages and social feeds to confirm that the world still saw her exactly as she wanted to be seen. Compliments, envy, invitations, proof that the image held. Yet beneath the silk sheets and curated beauty, there was a familiar restlessness she refused to acknowledge. Luxury, to Alicia, was not about ease or joy, it was armor, polished and heavy, worn to hide the gnawing fear of insignificance. Later that afternoon, she met friends at an exclusive boutique cafe, recounting the previous night with exaggerated charm. She framed the cake incident as clever, even necessary, a story designed to provoke laughter and admiration. Heads nodded, glasses clinked, but Alicia watched their reactions closely, measuring approval with surgical precision. What she didn't share, what she never shared, was how fragile her control actually felt. The designer labels, the carefully chosen words, the proximity to men like Andrew were all part of a strategy she'd perfected over years. She couldn't afford sentimentality. Sentimentality didn't pay rent, didn't guarantee access, didn't secure a future. That evening, alone again, Alicia's confidence wavered just enough to let the truth surface. She studied her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her expression until it matched the version she sold to the world. The envy she felt toward women like Juliet, women who built something real with their hands, curdled into quiet resentment. Alicia dismissed the feeling quickly, replacing it with ambition sharpened by calculation. She told herself that luxury was proof of success, that relationships were transactions, and that survival required dominance. What she didn't realize was that this philosophy, so carefully constructed, was already sowing the seeds of her own undoing, one decision at a time, hidden behind a flawless smile. The following week forced Juliet to confront realities she had long postponed under the illusion of marital stability. Sitting at the small wooden desk in the back of her bakery, she spread out invoices, supplier statements, and bank records with a clarity sharpened by recent pain. Without Andrew's interference, his impulsive withdrawals, his dismissive attitude toward budgeting, the truth emerged plainly. The bakery was surviving, but barely. Margins were thin, equipment aging, and certain costs had been quietly ballooning for years. Yet beneath the strain, Juliet noticed something else. The numbers told a story not of failure, but of potential constrained by neglect and compromise. For the first time, she allowed herself to steady her business without filtering it through someone else's priorities. Nina Holloway stopped by that afternoon, claiming she wanted pastries but quickly sensing there was more weighing on her friend. Over coffee brewed too strong and sipped too slowly, Juliet shared what she'd discovered, not the humiliation, not yet, but the fragile state of the bakery. Nina listened carefully, her mind already working through possibilities. She pointed out patterns Juliet had overlooked: consistent customer loyalty, repeat bulk orders during holidays, and the untapped demand for customized baked goods. "You're thinking too small," Nina said gently, not as criticism but as revelation. Juliet felt the words settle deeply. For years, she had been encouraged, subtly, persistently, to shrink her dreams to fit someone else's comfort. That night, alone in the bakery after closing, Juliet walked between the counters and ovens with new eyes. This place had carried her through disappointment and self-doubt, but it had also been held back by fear, fear of risk, fear of standing alone, fear of wanting more. She touched the worn edge of the counter where she'd shaped thousands of loaves, feeling both the weight of exhaustion and the spark of resolve. The bakery was on the brink, yes, but not of collapse. It was on the brink of transformation. And whether it survived or soared would depend entirely on whether Juliet was finally willing to choose herself, without apology or permission. Caleb Moore found himself thinking about Juliet's bakery more often than he expected, the memory of that delivery refusing to loosen its grip. He had made hundreds of drop-offs over the years, birthdays, anniversaries, celebrations meant to mark joy, but none had carried the same weight as that cake. The look on Juliet's face, composed yet wounded, followed him through traffic and quiet evenings alike. He replayed the moment he placed the box on the counter, wishing he'd asked questions, wishing he'd refused. Though he told himself he'd simply been doing his job, the sense that he had participated in something cruel lingered stubbornly. On his next route through the neighborhood, Caleb slowed his bike instinctively as he passed the bakery. He didn't go inside. Instead, he watched from across the street, observing the steady flow of customers and Juliet's calm presence behind the counter. She looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, but in the way someone does when carrying invisible weight. Yet there was also something resolute about her movements, a quiet determination that contradicted the humiliation he had delivered days earlier. Caleb felt an urge to apologize, to acknowledge what had happened, but he hesitated, unsure whether his words would offer comfort or reopen a wound. That evening, Caleb mentioned the incident to his sister, framing it as a story he couldn't shake. She listened, then asked a simple question that unsettled him. If you were her, what would you want someone to do? The question followed him long after the conversation ended. Caleb realized that bearing witness came with responsibility, even when it was uncomfortable. He didn't yet know how, or if, he could make amends, but one thing was clear: Juliet Benjamin was no longer just another name on a delivery slip. Her strength in that moment had marked him, and he sensed that their paths were not finished crossing, even if neither of them understood why. Andrew curated his version of events with the same care he applied to his wardrobe and social calendar. At a rooftop bar overlooking the city, he leaned into the noise and laughter, recounting his liberation to Victor Lang and a circle of acquaintances who thrived on spectacle. Juliet, he claimed, had been holding him back, too cautious, too sentimental, too focused on small routines when he was meant for bigger things. He spoke in absolutes, flattening years of shared history into a convenient narrative of incompatibility. Each nod and approving chuckle reinforced his resolve to believe the story he was telling, until it felt almost true. The conversation shifted to ambition and image, and Andrew flourished there, describing a future unburdened by compromise. He emphasized sacrifice, his own, naturally, and framed cruelty as honesty. The cake incident became a punchline, retold with a grin that suggested cleverness rather than malice. When someone asked whether he'd gone too far, Andrew deflected with practiced ease, suggesting that strong decisions required strong gestures. Alicia, present but quiet, observed him closely, offering occasional affirmations that kept him buoyed and certain. Her approval mattered more than he admitted, and he leaned into it, eager to perform the role she admired. Later, alone in his apartment, Andrew's confidence wavered just enough to let doubt seep in. The laughter faded, replaced by the sterile quiet of rooms designed to impress rather than comfort. He scrolled through messages, seeking validation, and found it, but the satisfaction was thin. He didn't consider calling Juliet; that would disrupt the story he'd built. Instead, he refined it further, telling himself that truth was flexible and that outcomes justified methods. In shaping his narrative so carefully, Andrew failed to notice how brittle it was, and how easily it would shatter when tested by reality. Juliet arrived at the wholesale market before sunrise, the air cool and sharp, carrying the faint metallic scent of loading docks and fresh produce. She preferred these early hours, when transactions were quiet and decisions felt cleaner. Pushing a cart between stacked crates of flour and butter, she focused on prices, quality, and delivery schedules, details she once delegated but now reclaimed with intention. It was there, under flickering warehouse lights, that she noticed a man struggling to maneuver a hand truck overloaded with boxes stamped from a cafe supplier she recognized. He looked tired but determined, pausing to steady his load rather than asking for help. When one box tipped and split open, Juliet reacted on instinct, stepping forward to catch it before the contents spilled. The man thanked her, a little breathless, introducing himself as Thomas Reed. He explained, with a wry smile, that he owned a small cafe 2 streets over and that mornings like this were the only way to keep costs down. As they spoke, Juliet recognized a familiar cadence in his words, the careful optimism of someone surviving on discipline rather than luck. They traded brief observations about suppliers who cut corners and customers who noticed quality even when margins were tight. The conversation felt unforced, grounded, and unexpectedly steady. As dawn edged closer, painting the sky pale gray, Thomas mentioned his cafe struggles with waste and unpredictable demand. Juliet listened, thoughtful, then shared her own challenges with overproduction during slow weekdays. Neither proposed solutions outright, but the idea hovered between them, unspoken yet palpable. They exchanged contact information before parting, promising nothing more than to talk again. As Juliet loaded her purchases into her car, she felt a subtle shift, an unfamiliar sense of possibility rooted not in rescue or romance, but in collaboration. The morning had given her something rare, a meeting that asked for honesty and offered potential without spectacle, a quiet opening she didn't yet know how to name. Helen Ward had not planned to re-enter Alicia Gordon's orbit, but some names carried weight no matter how carefully they were avoided. Sitting in a quiet wine bar far removed from the places Alicia preferred to be seen, Helen listened as a mutual acquaintance casually mentioned Andrew Coleman's sudden rise in confidence and spending. The description felt uncomfortably familiar. Helen had seen this pattern before: men elevated quickly, encouraged recklessly, and drained before they understood what was happening. Alicia never forced anyone's hand, she merely praised ambition, whispered certainty, and made risk feel romantic. Helen's stomach tightened as recognition settled into certainty. Another cycle was beginning. A few days later, Helen arranged a chance encounter with Alicia under the pretense of nostalgia. They met briefly, exchanged surface-level pleasantries, and spoke of success as if it were a shared language. Helen watched carefully, noting how Alicia steered conversations toward wealth, leverage, and opportunity without revealing specifics. The manipulation was subtle, almost elegant. When Andrew's name surfaced, Alicia smiled just a little too knowingly, brushing it off as inconsequential. To Helen, the reaction confirmed everything. She remembered other men, confident at first, ruined later, each convinced they were different, smarter, immune. None of them had been. That evening, Helen reached out to someone she rarely contacted anymore, leaving a message that carried more urgency than explanation. She didn't name Alicia directly, but the warning was clear: pay attention to patterns, not promises. Helen understood that intervening carried risks. Alicia did not appreciate exposure, but silence felt worse. She had once been collateral damage in the same quiet destruction and had sworn never to watch it happen again without trying to stop it. Whether anyone would listen was uncertain, but the truth had surfaced, and once seen clearly, it could no longer be ignored. Juliet's decision did not arrive with fanfare or reassurance. It came quietly, late at night, while she reviewed numbers for the third time and realized hesitation was costing her more than risk ever could. She extended the bakery's hours before dawn and after dusk, restructured her menu to focus on consistency rather than novelty, and committed to small batch precision that demanded discipline every single day. There were no congratulatory messages, no sudden praise. Customers noticed the improvements without knowing the cost behind them. Juliet learned to accept that progress often advances without witnesses, driven by resolve rather than recognition. The changes took a toll almost immediately. Fatigue settled into her bones, and there were mornings when her hands trembled from exhaustion as she weighed ingredients with exacting care. Yet the work steadied her in a way comfort never had. Nina checked in often, offering logistical support and blunt reminders to protect margins and boundaries alike. Martha provided quiet stability at home, making sure Juliet ate and slept when she could. Every choice Juliet made was deliberate, stripped of the need to please anyone else. She wasn't chasing validation, she was building reliability, the kind that compounds slowly and lasts. Weeks passed before Juliet allowed herself to acknowledge the subtle shift taking place. Orders became more predictable. Waste decreased. A few regulars began requesting standing pickups, trusting her timing and quality without question. None of it was dramatic enough to feel like success, yet together it formed a foundation that felt solid underfoot. Juliet kept her head down, resisting the temptation to announce growth prematurely. She understood now that applause could be a distraction, even a liability. What mattered was the work, steady, uncelebrated, and honest, carrying her forward one disciplined decision at a time. Andrew met Mark Delaney in a glass-walled lounge that specialized in making bold claims feel inevitable. Mark arrived early, confident without being loud, dressed in understated elegance that suggested access rather than effort. He spoke in measured tones about opportunities that favored decisiveness and punished hesitation, framing risk as a temporary discomfort on the path to permanence. Andrew listened, enthralled, the language hitting every insecurity he tried to outrun. Mark didn't promise miracles, he promised alignment, capital meeting momentum at exactly the right moment. It sounded responsible. It sounded grown. It sounded like the validation Andrew had been chasing. Alicia encouraged the connection with unusual intensity, positioning Mark as a rare find rather than a gamble. She praised Andrew's instincts, reinforcing the idea that success favored those willing to move quickly while others stalled. Each time Andrew raised a question, Alicia reframed it as fear dressed up as prudence, reminding him how often caution had kept him small. Mark supplied charts and timelines that appeared thorough without inviting scrutiny, carefully steering conversations away from specifics that could anchor doubt. Andrew felt chosen, included in something exclusive, and that feeling alone made the plan seem credible. By the end of the week, Andrew had committed more than he initially intended. The paperwork moved fast, signatures landing with satisfying finality. He told himself this was confidence, not recklessness, that decisive men didn't linger over details. The money transferred cleanly, and Mark's assurances remained calm and precise. Alicia celebrated with champagne, framing the move as the beginning of their real life. Andrew believed her, buoyed by momentum and praise, unaware that the plan's strength depended not on sound fundamentals, but on how quickly he would be convinced to give more. Eleanor Price did not announce herself when she stepped into Juliet's bakery on a quiet weekday morning. She wore understated clothing, carried no entourage, and asked simple questions about ingredients and timing like any other customer who valued consistency. She ordered a small selection, nothing extravagant, and paid in cash, observing the room with an economy of attention that missed nothing. Eleanor noticed the way Juliet handled the counter with calm authority, how staff moved with purpose rather than haste, and how regulars greeted her with trust that felt earned. This was not a place chasing trends, it was a place practicing reliability. Eleanor took the pastries to her office and tasted them alone, the way she always did when evaluating something that might matter. She noted balance, texture, restraint, choices that suggested discipline rather than showmanship. What impressed her most was not innovation but repeatability. These were products that could travel without losing their integrity. She asked her assistant to research the bakery quietly, no press, no introductions, no alerts. The report that came back was modest, single location, long hours, careful cost control, but it carried a through line Eleanor respected. The business was growing without noise, and that often meant it was growing correctly. Within days, inquiries began arriving at the bakery that Juliet did not immediately recognize, requests for volume pricing, delivery windows, and compliance details framed as casual questions. Juliet answered carefully, sensing opportunity without chasing it. Nina noticed the shift and advised patience, reminding her that serious interest often arrived disguised as curiosity. Juliet agreed, grounding herself in process rather than anticipation. She didn't know Eleanor's name yet, but she felt the current changing, subtle and powerful. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood, the country had begun to talk, not loudly, not publicly, but with intent. The email arrived without ornamentation, subject line concise and professional, requesting a meeting at a neutral location during standard business hours. Juliet read it twice, then once more aloud to Nina, who recognized the tone immediately. This wasn't curiosity anymore, it was intent. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room with windows that overlooked nothing memorable, a deliberate choice that kept attention on substance. Eleanor Price introduced herself plainly, outlining expectations rather than promises. She spoke about capacity, consistency, and accountability, emphasizing that growth would be gradual and measured. Juliet listened more than she spoke, answering questions directly, resisting the urge to oversell. By the time the meeting ended, the air felt charged with possibility and responsibility. The contract that followed was thick with clauses and contingencies, designed to protect both sides from haste. Juliet spent days reviewing it line by line, consulting Nina and a local advisor who specialized in supply agreements. There were moments when the scale of it all felt unreal: regional distribution, phased expansion, and benchmarks tied to quality rather than hype. Signing would mean longer hours, tighter margins at first, and a level of scrutiny she had never faced. It would also mean stepping into a larger arena without the safety net of obscurity. Juliet weighed each implication carefully, understanding that this wasn't rescue, it was an invitation that demanded readiness. When she finally signed, there was no celebration. Eleanor shook her hand once, firmly, and reminded her that trust would be earned continuously, not assumed. Juliet returned to the bakery the same day, rolling up her sleeves and adjusting schedules as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. The contract quietly repositioned her work from neighborhood staple to national contender, altering the trajectory of her life without spectacle. She felt the gravity of the commitment settle in, not as fear, but as focus. This was the moment discipline met opportunity, and Juliet understood that what followed would test not her talent, but her endurance. Andrew's calendar filled faster than his accounts, a blur of reservations, purchases, and plans that signaled success without securing it. He upgraded apartments, justified new wardrobes, and accepted invitations that came with expectations of generosity he felt compelled to meet. The lifestyle looked effortless from the outside: chauffeured arrivals, exclusive lounges, conversations lubricated by praise, but it demanded constant feeding. Each expense was framed as momentum, proof that he was finally moving at the speed he deserved. Alicia encouraged the pace, reminding him that appearances created leverage. Andrew nodded, ignoring the faint discomfort that surfaced whenever he checked balances too quickly and closed the app before the numbers fully registered. Mark Delaney's updates arrived regularly, polished and reassuring, full of timelines that slid subtly with each message. There were always explanations: market timing, regulatory sequencing, strategic patience, that made delay sound prudent rather than alarming. Andrew forwarded the messages to Alicia, who responded with confidence that felt contagious. She spoke about patience as if it were a test of faith, insisting that pressure was the price of entry into serious wealth. Andrew wanted to believe her. He told himself that anxiety was simply the echo of old limitations he was outgrowing. Doubt, after all, was for people who hesitated, and he had chosen not to. Yet the cracks were there, thin and persistent. A promised document failed to arrive. A scheduled call was postponed twice. When Andrew asked sharper questions, Mark answered smoothly but without detail, redirecting toward future milestones. Alicia brushed off concerns with practiced warmth, suggesting Andrew was overthinking. Alone at night, Andrew felt the unease creep in, unwelcome and insistent. He silenced it by booking another trip, another dinner, another visible marker of success. The lavishness continued, glittering and loud, while beneath it the structure weakened, quietly, steadily, waiting for the moment when denial would no longer be enough. The message arrived just after midnight, concise and devastating in its simplicity. Andrew read it once, then again, the words blurring as his pulse climbed. The account was temporarily inaccessible due to a procedural adjustment. He told himself it was a delay, nothing more, but when he tried to log in, the portal returned an error that felt final. He called Mark Delaney immediately, pacing the length of his apartment while the call rang unanswered. Minutes stretched. Andrew refreshed emails, checked timestamps, replayed recent conversations, searching for reassurance that refused to appear. The apartment, once a symbol of ascent, now echoed with the sound of his own breathing. By morning, Alicia was already reframing the situation. She spoke calmly, suggesting this was the kind of turbulence serious investors endured before payoff. She urged Andrew to show confidence, to protect the position, by consolidating everything into the plan while the window remained open. The logic felt inverted, but Alicia's certainty pressed hard against his fear, offering direction where doubt threatened to paralyze him. Andrew signed additional transfers with hands that shook only slightly, telling himself decisive men didn't retreat at the first obstacle. He didn't notice how quickly Alicia stopped asking questions and started issuing instructions. When the confirmation finally came, it didn't announce itself with drama. There was no alert, no apology, just silence where access had once existed. The numbers vanished. Calls went unanswered. Mark's office line disconnected. Andrew sat at the kitchen counter, staring at his phone as if it might explain itself. The realization landed slowly, then all at once: the plan hadn't stalled, it had closed. The trap had snapped shut, clean and efficient, leaving him on the wrong side of certainty. And for the first time since the cake, Andrew understood humiliation not as spectacle, but as the quiet collapse of control. The unraveling did not arrive all at once. It came in waves that stripped Andrew's life of comfort piece by piece. The first notices were polite, emails requesting clarification, reminders of obligations he had once waved away with confidence. Then the tone shifted. Creditors called during meals, during meetings, during the early hours he once reserved for sleep. Accounts were frozen pending review. Subscriptions failed. Invitations stopped. The city that had applauded his momentum now regarded him with indifference, and the silence was louder than any accusation. Andrew tried to explain, to friends, to service providers, to himself, but explanations had no currency where numbers no longer balanced. Alicia was gone before he admitted it to himself. Her messages slowed, then ceased, replaced by a curated social feed that suggested distance without acknowledging it. Andrew scrolled compulsively, searching for a sign of concern, a hint of loyalty, anything that might anchor him to the version of reality he'd believed in. There was none. Victor Lang stopped answering calls, claiming travel, then never followed up. Even casual acquaintances grew elusive. Andrew discovered that the lavishness he had cultivated offered no shelter when stripped of funding. Without money to sustain the image, there was no role left for him to play. By the end of the week, Andrew sat alone in a downsized apartment he had moved into hastily, boxes still unpacked, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to make sense. There was no one to blame convincingly, only a chain of choices he had made willingly, applauded by the wrong people. He considered reaching out to Juliet, then dismissed the thought as quickly as it formed, ashamed and afraid of what he might hear. The collapse offered no lessons wrapped in mercy, no audience to witness repentance. It was simply consequence, arriving without sympathy, demanding accountability he had long deferred. The announcement came quietly, embedded in an industry bulletin that circulated among distributors before it reached the wider public. Juliet Benjamin's Bakery, once a single storefront known only to a neighborhood, had completed its third phased expansion under a national distribution agreement. New facilities were operational, quality benchmarks exceeded, and repeat contracts locked in. There were no splashy headlines yet, just confirmations that mattered to people who understood scale. Eleanor Price's firm released a measured statement emphasizing consistency and discipline. Juliet read the notice in her office after closing, hand steady, heart full but contained. She had learned to receive milestones without spectacle, letting proof speak for itself. Andrew encountered the news by accident, scrolling aimlessly through updates he could no longer afford to ignore. The name caught his eye first, then the numbers. He reread the paragraph twice, then a third time, the realization settling like ice. Juliet hadn't just survived, she had built something formidable, methodically, publicly, and without him. The cake flashed through his mind, its cruelty reframed by time and consequence. He understood then how thoroughly he had misjudged her, mistaking restraint for weakness and silence for incapacity. The truth arrived without mercy. While he chased appearance, Juliet cultivated substance. The final blow came later that night, delivered not by a headline but by a message forwarded anonymously. It contained documents, communications, timelines, patterns, linking Alicia Gordon to similar financial implosions. Introductions made, pressure applied, exits timed precisely. Andrew recognized the language immediately, he had lived inside it. The confirmation hollowed him out. Alicia hadn't merely encouraged his risk, she had engineered the conditions for collapse, guiding him toward a trap she knew well. The realization stunned him, not because it was shocking, but because it made devastating sense. For the first time, Andrew saw the full shape of his choices and the cost of trusting applause over integrity. Juliet stood in the quiet of a new kitchen before sunrise, stainless steel surfaces gleaming under soft lights, the air already warm with preparation. The scale of the space no longer startled her, it felt earned. Teams moved with calm efficiency, guided by processes she had helped design and values she refused to dilute. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, only the steady rhythm of work beginning on time, orders cued with precision, and standards enforced without drama. Juliet felt a deep, settled gratitude, not for the outcome alone, but for the discipline that carried her here. She had learned that beginnings didn't need applause to be real. Across the city, Andrew faced a quieter reckoning. There were forms to complete, calls to return, and obligations to meet with patients he had never practiced before. The absence of spectacle was its own lesson. He took responsibility where he could, resisted the urge to explain himself into absolution, and accepted that recovery, if it came, would be slow and unglamorous. The memory of the cake lingered not as shame, but as clarity. It marked the moment he chose cruelty over character and applause over accountability. He did not seek Juliet out. Some bridges, he understood now, were not meant to be rebuilt. Weeks later, Juliet visited her original bakery after closing, walking the familiar floor one last time before it transitioned into a training space for new teams. She paused by the counter where the cake had once sat, acknowledging the past without inviting it back. Her life had expanded, but her principles had not. The lesson she carried forward was simple and enduring: humiliation can fracture, but restraint can build. Noise can impress, but consistency endures. Juliet locked the door, turned toward the future, and stepped into it, unencumbered, intentional, and fully her own. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.